Remember that old song, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands? How about if you're jaded and you know it, clap your hands? Jaded and I know it. What's more powerful than money? Influence. And right relationships are optimal, and you can have about anything you want. You really can. You can have about anything you want. A lot of it just comes down to waiting. And then for those of us who have an ability to suffer long or to wait a long time, the question becomes, is it a reasonable wait? Is that wait for this certain thing promoting other things that are priorities in your life or taking away? And so sometimes we have to come up with reasonable conclusions. And that can be tough because that can affect pride, it can affect desire, it can affect optimism. And usually when we get in those, what someone might feel is a complicated thought decision process, whether to continue with something or not, there's a lot of feelings and emotions that can develop with that. When we talk about leadership, let's contrast public and private to a degree. Imagine you're downtown, you're driving on the highway, and you see the huge skyscraper, has your name on it, it's your brand, it's you, and everyone can see you are out there, you are huge, your influence is there. People know what you do, how you do it, who you are, what your purpose is. You are a huge skyscraper. But the real you, the one that happens on a daily level, who's crunching numbers, who's evaluating, who's counseling, you're somewhere not visible. You're usually spending most of your time way deep in the inner chambers of that building in the office. So that is a imagination and imagery of our leadership brand sometimes, or our leadership execution, or just overall concept of leadership, where there's a very public presence about leadership, but all that strength, think of an old time, preacher who would come out and give a message on a Sunday morning, and then he would just fast and pray, for the other 6 days. It's being able to have that same picture, but in everyday leadership, where there's a very public side to us, but then there's also a very private side. Now, I'm not trying to depict two different people or hypocritical value, but what I'm trying to know is the strength of where you're working in the inner chamber. Your close counsel, your close friends, your close associates, being able to really be intimate about the values of your brand and your execution of your organization. You see, life experience, I'm not even going to look up the word right now, jaded, what that means in Webster, but for what we get a sense for on the street, when you say someone is jaded, to me, I don't want to say necessarily, people say you get bitter or you get better. And, I want to say, life experience will make me better. I don't want to say bitter, but at the same time, it's also very wise and natural to learn from experiences that we go through, and to experience transformation, or even maybe feel changes from things that we've gone through. And when we start to feel that sense of jadedness, where we're not necessarily bitter, but we don't find ourselves at being the 9-year-old schoolboy optimism, like everything is pure and innocent, a viewpoint of a little boy, little girl coming up. then it becomes an interesting thing. Now, if you grew up in the tough life, sometimes, you know, it takes certain exposures to realize that you might already be possessing jaded attributes, you know, when you're young. For those who might grow up very innocently, very optimistically, sometimes it takes some hard blows in life and then comprehension of what is going on, because if not, you can pitfall into depression and anxiety. But the key is, just like the skyscraper and inner chamber office example, there's kind of a twofold picture here too. The key is always trying to be astute over our heart, to keep that tender and sensitive, to keep our heart soft. But, you know, when you talk about, do I become better or bitter, and you override that conversation by saying, of course I'm going to get better, but I do feel this jadedness, what we have to do is channel that energy into the appropriate places. So it's important for me not to channel that into some of my core internal heart feelings and how I operate as an individual, but at the same time, where I can channel that jaded energy is in setting up borders and guidelines that are fortified in my life. And that's where you see strength being built. That's where you see wisdom being built. So if you think, man, I was such an optimistic 14-year-old or 20-year-old or 24-year-old, and now all this life has happened, you know, at the same time, pat yourself on the back, because if you're 48, you don't want to be a 14-year-old still. You know, let time be your friend. Let these experiences that have been hard and hellish and horrific turn to, you know, not to kill that inner child, if you will, but to give strength around that inner child to be able to function and to freely be able to develop. Because as you get older, then age becomes a beautiful friend of yours. And actually quite a good friend to that young child inside. So what do I do? What do I do? You know, number one is family. Number one is family. You have to have the things that bring you back to center. Number one is, you know, family dinner, early morning routines, just family, you know, not the phone, not everyone else and their mother and father and cousin and third uncle. I mean, it's my family, my immediate, my daughter, my son. You know, getting personal workouts in. I love mixing it up. You know, I love hot yoga. You know, I love going on a hike. You know, of course, basketball. That's like, you know, what I said before. You know, what fishing was to Peter, James, and John. I mean, that's me. You know, basketball. You know. You know, I'll show up random places. I can remember a young guy that I worked with when I was younger, and he got admitted to a psych ward downtown, and for some reason he, you know, had me be the call, so I remember coming to visit. Just think of like some rough streets, you know, just different things, you know, like I would encourage you, like, you know, be safe about it, but show up to a random place, you know, go have coffee by yourself at some little joint by yourself, you know, like take channels of energy and pathway that might seem a little curious to you, and explore those, and let that kind of build up an energy and a health to you. Or pick what's good to you. Pick what's good and energizing to you. We're all a little bit different there. You know, one thing that I used to utilize a lot when I was young, and I still draw strength from it. Not that I'm old now, but although my birthday's coming up, and my kids have to remind me how old I'm actually going to be. So maybe I am getting old, but fasting, it's something, maybe not as intentional, but I definitely still have been operating with as of late. I think when you go on these little stretches where you just have these disciplines, where you could go out for a steak, but you choose not to. These times of reservation or conservation, or being internalized a little bit, being homebound a little bit more, just doing these little different pathways, even if they're little bursts, one meal, one day, half a day, it seems like there's always such an appreciation then for a nice warm meal, and just kind of a quiet mindset going back into the execution of certain things. And so what I want to bring conclusion to this is meaningful execution. So if I'm jaded and I know it, okay, I know that I want to get better from something, not bitter. So I'm in that battle, but intentionally I want to get better. I don't want to be a bitter person, but I do feel jaded. I don't feel like that 7-year-old bright-eyed, hey, I'm going to walk on the moon or be president by the time I'm 20 or be in the NBA, whatever. And you have these life experiences. The beautiful thing is being able to turn these things, keeping the heart, keeping the inner chambers tender, but being able to have fortified boundaries and guidelines on the outside where that wisdom can protect that inner desire. So when we go to meaningful execution, this is where we talk about meaningful optimism, where it's just not a pie in the sky optimism necessarily, or I wish I had a better explanation than that. It's not just me thinking, a purple elephant could fly down the sky right now. But it's meaningful optimism that not because of purely an imaginative thought alone, but also because of experience, counsel, things that I've been through. I know that I can overcome this certain situation. I know we as a team can do such and such. It's weighty optimism. And the beautiful thing there is when we start to get curious about those things at that type of leadership level. I had a dear friend talk to me about being curious, and I think that's such an interesting concept. When you feel something, it's like, hey, allow yourself the opportunity to be curious about that thought, that feeling. And when we can kind of get into this observing type perspective mindset of leadership, some powerful things can happen. And when you have that type of fortification, that is what sustains you on new paths, while you still can be principled. I've talked about it before. Human nature is one leg shorter than the other, and that's what takes you onto that circle. That's what gives you the strength and fortification to say it's not just a far out fetch idea, but I have the strength and the experience and the wherewithal to execute that optimism out, to make that dream a reality, or to engage in it enough where it becomes part of the legacy that I then pass on to other leaders and other generations. So if you're jaded and you know it, don't count yourself out. It's not just about becoming bitter or better. You have the intention to become better, but you have a lot of feelings that you're dealing with, maybe mistrust, apprehension. Keep the heart tender, keep your brand out there, but in the inner chambers, let that be tender, let that be transparent, let that be heartfelt, let that be curious, and let that fortification take place in your principles and your guidelines, and some of your outward executions while keeping the heart tender. So I'm jaded and I know it. Let's clap our hands. Let's get the sun out. Let's put the umbrella away and drink this coffee. Have a great, great morning. MLS.